I knew from the moment I saw the neon orange slip taped to my front door that this neighborhood wasn't going to be the peaceful little retreat I thought I was buying into. The house itself was perfect. Big backyard, private driveway, tall trees that gave me shade in the summer and a bit of privacy year-round. But the Homeowners Association, that was a nightmare wrapped in a smile, and the queen of that nightmare was a woman named Karen. The slip said I owed $500. The reason? Improper vehicle storage. That was the official wording. The translation? I had parked my truck in my own damn driveway overnight. Now, before you think this was some rusty old junker sitting on cinder blocks, let me explain. This was a spotless F-150, polished every weekend, gleaming paint, not a dent in sight. But Karen had decided trucks weren't aesthetic enough for the neighborhood. She wanted everyone's driveways empty at night, cars tucked away in their garages like dirty secrets. The problem? My garage wasn't a garage anymore. I had converted it into a workshop, my sanctuary, where I built custom furniture as a side hustle. I'd explained that when I first moved in, but explanations don't work with people like Karen. They don't want reasons. They want control, and Karen thrived on control. That night, I stood on my porch holding that fine slip in my hand, staring across the cul-de-sac at her house. Sure enough, there she was, watering her roses in the dark like some kind of suburban vampire, pretending not to watch me but keeping one eye fixed on my reaction. She wanted me to march over, argue, beg. She wanted the drama. I gave her nothing, just a slow smile and a wave. And the look on her face told me she hated that more than if I'd screamed at her. I paid the fine. Not because I accepted it, but because I wanted time. I needed to understand what kind of battlefield I had just walked into. Over the next week, I started noticing the patterns. Karen was the president of the HOA, of course. She walked the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, notebook in hand, jotting down violations. She fined one neighbor for leaving a trash can at the curb past 7 p.m., another for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. Someone else got hit with a $250 fine because their lawn was 1.5 inches above regulation height. It wasn't about rules. It was about reminding everyone that she was in charge. I tried to lay low at first, kept my truck parked on the side street a block away, just to avoid more tickets. But that wasn't good enough for Karen. Oh no. Once she decided you were a target, she never let up. The second fine came 2 weeks later. Unauthorized exterior modification. My crime, hanging a bird feeder from the oak tree in my front yard, that one cost me $200 by the third. Fine, $150 for improper seasonal decorations. Because I left my porch lights up a week after the 4th of July, I realized Karen wasn't going to stop until I broke. But here's the thing about me. I don't break. I sat at my kitchen table late one night, all 3 fine slips spread out in front of me, and I felt the anger bubbling inside. But it wasn't the kind of anger that makes you yell. It was the cold kind, the kind that makes you think, makes you plan. Karen thought she had all the power because she ran the HOA. What she didn't realize was that HOA boards aren't just dictatorships. They're subject to bylaws, to rules, to oversight, and people like her always make mistakes. So I started digging. I requested copies of the HOA's bylaws. I asked for financial statements, meeting minutes, all the boring paperwork that most neighbors never bothered to look at. Karen tried to stall me, of course, but by law she had to provide them. And when I finally got my hands on the records, I saw the cracks in her little empire. She'd been charging administrative fees that didn't exist in the bylaws. She was fining people at random without proper votes. She'd even been using HOA funds for landscaping improvements that just so happened to be at her house. The more I read, the more I realized Karen wasn't just annoying. She was dirty. And in that moment, I knew exactly how this war was going to play out. I wasn't just going to fight her fines. I was going to pull the rug out from under her throne, piece by piece, until she was the one paying through the nose. But revenge is a dish, best served slow, so when she slapped me with my 4th fine, a $500 penalty for unsanctioned commercial activity, because I sold a handmade coffee table to a friend out of my garage, I didn't blow up. I paid it just like before. I smiled when I saw her watching from her window. I even waved again because she thought she was winning. And that was the sweetest part. Inside, I was already building my case. The funny thing about people like Karen is that they mistake silence for surrender. She saw me paying her fines without a fight and thought she'd broken me down. What she didn't realize was that every slip of paper she taped to my door was another brick in the wall I was building against her. By the time the fifth fine arrived, she had gotten bold. This one was for $750. The reason? Violation of neighborhood harmony. I kid you not, that's what she wrote. Apparently my truck was still disrupting the flow of community aesthetics, even though I had been parking it on the side street out of sight. I could almost admire the creativity. Almost. That night, I walked outside and stood in my driveway just to get some fresh air, and of course, there she was, Karen, her silhouette glowing behind her curtain watching me. It wasn't subtle. She wanted me to know that every move I made was under her microscope. I waved again. The curtain snapped shut. What she didn't know was that I'd already started talking to my neighbors. Not everyone, just the ones I trusted. The older couple down the street who'd been fined for having a garden shed. The young family who got hit because their kids left bikes in the yard. The retired vet who nearly lost his pension check because Karen fined him so many times for unsightly lawn furniture. When I mentioned that I was looking into the HOA's finances, I saw the spark light up in their eyes. One by one, they told me their stories. Every single household in the subdivision had been bled dry by Karen's so-called rules, but they were afraid. Karen had been running the HOA unopposed for nearly a decade. She scared people into silence with threats of liens, lawsuits, foreclosure. Nobody wanted to risk it. Me? I had nothing to lose. The deeper I dug into the records, the uglier it got. The HOA collected nearly $120,000 a year in dues. Where did it go? According to Karen, the beautification projects. But the projects never seemed to leave her yard. New paving stones for her walkway. A custom fence around her backyard pool. Expensive shrubs that somehow matched the exact ones I saw planted outside her front windows. The woman wasn't just on a power trip. She was robbing the neighborhood blind. One night, after another long session of highlighting discrepancies in the financial reports, I leaned back in my chair and thought about how easy it would be to expose her. Call a lawyer, take it to the county, hand everything over and watch her burn. But that felt too easy, too fast. Karen had spent years making everyone miserable. If I pulled the trigger too soon, the board might remove her quietly, let her slip away without consequences. No, I wanted her to feel the walls close in. I wanted her to know exactly who had taken her crown. So I waited. The escalation came right on schedule. Karen must have noticed that I wasn't breaking under the weight of the fines, so she switched tactics. She started sending me violation notices for things that didn't even exist. Unapproved fence installation. I didn't have a fence. Excessive noise disturbance. I lived alone and barely watched TV. Improper holiday display. I hadn't put up a single decoration. It was harassment, plain and simple. But the thing about harassers? The more desperate they get, the sloppier they become. And sloppy was exactly what I needed her to be. By the time she tried to fine me $1,000 for running an illegal lumber mill because she saw me cutting wood in my garage, I had everything I needed: the bylaws, the financials, the neighbor testimonies, the proof that she had overstepped her authority again and again. All that was left was timing. The annual HOA meeting was coming up in 3 weeks. For most people, it was a boring formality. A couple of people in folding chairs listening to Karen drone on about community spirit before she voted herself another year as president. But this year would be different. I started spreading the word quietly. Told my neighbors that if they were tired of Karen's reign, they needed to show up. Promised them that this time things would change. Some were skeptical, others were scared, but enough of them nodded and said, "I'll be there," that I knew I had momentum. Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed something brewing, because she doubled down. She marched up to my house one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing her smug little smile. "Good morning," she said, like we were old friends. "I've come to discuss your ongoing violations." I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "Violations? You mean the ones you make up as you go?" Her smile faltered just for a second before snapping back into place. "Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." I chuckled. "Funny, I was thinking the same thing about you." Her eyes narrowed, and I could almost see the gears turning in her head. She wanted to find me right there on the spot for insolence, but there wasn't a box for that on her clipboard. Instead, she leaned in close and whispered, You think you're clever, but people like you never last here. I always win. I didn't say a word. Just let her walk away, heels clicking like a gavel. Because the truth was I wasn't just planning to outlast her. I was planning to bury her. The night before the meeting, I didn't sleep. I sat at my dining room table surrounded by binders, receipts, and highlighted documents, going over every line one more time. My case was airtight. The only question was whether the neighbors would have the courage to stand with me when the time came. When the sun came up, I looked out my window and saw Karen pacing her driveway, clipboard in hand, rehearsing whatever speech she was going to give. She had no idea that this was the last day she would ever stand tall in this neighborhood. And that thought made me smile for the first time in months. She showed up to the meeting wearing armor, crisp white blouse, pearls, the same pursed lip expression she used when she marked people down for having the audacity to dry a towel on their fence. She moved through the folding chairs like a general inspecting her troops, smiling at familiar faces and offering the kind of warm, practiced nod that said, "I own this room." For a moment watching her, I felt that old tug of doubt, the one that wondered if we were making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe she was just a busybody. Maybe the fines were petty but legal. Maybe I was a bitter single man picking a fight I couldn't win. Then the room filled up. Not dozens, but enough. A gaggle of neighbors who had hidden their grievances for years until someone finally gave them permission to speak. Faces I recognized from lawns and garage sales. People who had muttered, "She's gone too far," in passing but never done anything. The retired vet with the sunburned knuckles. The couple whose daughter had cried when the HOA threatened to take down her treehouse. The young dad whose kids' bikes had once been confiscated for blocking the curb. They sat down with polite shuffles and stiffened shoulders, and I realized none of this was about me anymore. It was about all of us. Karen took the podium, really. The folding table on which she always placed her little HOA president tent card, and launched into her spiel about community standards and the sacred duty of keeping property values high. She spoke with the same rhythm as a sermon, a steady cadence meant to lull and dominate. Then she smiled at me like a shark smiling at a struggling fish and announced that she had concerns about the number of violations issued recently, and that tonight's meeting would proceed as scheduled. I waited until she finished, until the polite applause died down, then rose to speak. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced this in the mirror, in the car at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. Brevity would be my weapon. Facts my sword. "Good evening," I said. "I'm here because this community deserves better than arbitrary punishments and unexplained charges. I requested the HOA records 3 months ago. I received them. The expenditures listed under beautification do not match the projects we have in common areas. The administrative fees you've collected are not authorized by our bylaws. I have evidence that I will present, and I respectfully request an independent audit." There was a murmur. Karen's smile thinned. She tried to interrupt, politely of course, with a hand raised and the kind of faux concern that sounds like compassion but reads as control. But I had anticipated that. I slid a stack of photocopies across the table to the secretary, who looked at them with widening eyes. They were clean. Ledgers, invoices, receipts for landscaping, invoices that matched vendors I'd called and confirmed had only ever worked at Karen's property. Silence fell like a curtain. Karen's face changed color in the way a storm cloud does when lightning passes through it. Sudden, jagged, impossible to miss. Her practiced demeanor cracked. For a brief second she was just a woman, not a title, and the frailness beneath the pomposity looked small. "You can't just—" she began. "Yes, I can," I said. Bylaw 4.2 states that any member may request a full accounting. Bylaw 7.1 requires a vote of the board to levy fines and special assessments. The records show fines issued without recorded votes and funds spent with no documented approvals. I'm asking the board to call an emergency audit and to suspend any unilateral financial decisions by the president until the audit is complete. Heads turned to the board members, 3 of them sitting stiffly, faces pale under fluorescent lighting. Some avoided eye contact, some didn't. An old woman near the back stood up, hands trembling not from age but from anger. "He got fined for a truck," she said. "My husband's been fined for a wobbly mailbox that our grandson knocked into." We've all been scared into silence. Not anymore. Voices rose, not shouting yet, but the kind of rising tide that drowns pretense. People who had been small at their own kitchen tables found their voices in numbers. One by one, they stepped forward and told their stories. The young dad displayed a little stack of envelopes, fines stapled to notices, each stamped, each without a signature from the board. The older couple produced photographs showing the same contractor who'd improved community walkways had been at their property too, at Karen's direction, they claimed, for her private landscaping. The retired vet showed us a bill showing that HOA funds had paid for a new decking on the back of Karen's house. Karen tried to respond. With the playbook, she invoked community, values, and necessary expenditures. When confronted with invoices, she accused us of forgery and fraud. She threatened legal action, the most garish of her theatrics. She glanced at me as if daring me to press harder. I did press. I'd brought more than copies. I'd brought a plan. An audit wouldn't happen overnight, so I asked for 2 immediate actions: a temporary moratorium on new fines and an emergency vote to suspend Karen's signing authority on HOA checks. The bylaws allowed for emergency actions in cases of suspected malfeasance. All it took was a majority of members present and a simple count. There was a moment, a sliver of possibility, where the room could have convulsed into chaos. Karen called for order, and a handful of neighbors, still uncertain, wanted to postpone. But the stories had done their work. Fear turned into indignation. People realized this was no petty spat. It was theft of a kind. They voted. Hands went up like birds taking flight. The moratorium passed. The suspension passed. Karen's face, which had been the color of a woman who'd swallowed bile, turned the color of someone who had been stripped of an illusion. She sat down with a small, sharp sound and fumbled with her purse, hands shaking. From there, the meeting split into logistics. Who would oversee the audit? Who would be the neutral third party? I suggested a local CPA the vet had used. It would cost money, but we had collective dues. Maybe we all swallowed our pride, but if the audit confirmed the misappropriation, the money would be recouped. Better yet, if crimes had been committed, the county would take an interest. Karen protested that the motion was illegal, that we were staging a coup. She accused me, so theatrically, that I felt for a moment like stepping forward and raising my voice, but the room had already decided. Her calls to order sounded hollow. The board, some of them who had clearly grown comfortable in their complicity, started to squirm. 2 of them abstained. 1 voted with us. The tide had turned. After the meeting, a small knot of neighbors gathered in the parking lot, whispering and planning. Karen stood on her porch glaring, but she didn't venture out. The audacity of her doing anything in public had been removed like a mask. That night, as the neighborhood lights blinked on one by one, my phone buzzed. It was the CPA. He'd agreed to meet within days and do a preliminary review pro bono if we had enough documentation. It was the sort of small victory that tasted like copper and sugar. Not sweet yet, but promising. But victory even when procedural makes enemies desperate. Karen called a lawyer overnight. Emails arrived the next morning, menacing, full of legalese, accusing me of libel and threatening to file restraining orders and to pursue damages for harassment. She sent a letter to the board demanding an apology and a retraction, insisting that the HOA was within its rights and that I was fomenting rebellion. I forwarded the letter to the board and the CPA with a note. "Keep it. We need a copy." He replied with a calm message that read like a knife. "If there is evidence of misuse of funds, this letter will not protect Ms. Karen's last name. The county has hard rules about fiduciary duty. If HOA funds were used for personal gain, that's fraud. Collect all invoices. Record witness statements. We'll need everything." We compiled evidence like a jury building a case. Neighbors who had been silent for years found courage in their numbers. Some, I learned, had been threatened with liens if they refused to pay fines. One woman brought in a stack of check copies showing that payments had been deposited into an account that, while nominally HOA, included a number of checks labeled reimbursement for private landscaping. Another neighbor found an email where Karen had thanked a contractor for special service and asked for expedited billing. The CPA found discrepancies that made his jaw tighten. He called for a formal audit. He urged us to consider filing a report with the county if the audit suggested criminal wrongdoing. Embezzlement, abuse of fiduciary duty. That ugly language you read about in news stories. He was careful in his phrasing, but his eyes told the truth. This was bad, and it could get worse for Karen. That night, while neighbors clustered on porches and discussed logistics quietly, Karen pulled into her driveway with a box of what looked like files. I watched from my kitchen window as she disappeared inside and reappeared with a different box, like someone trying to shred the past in a desperate, fumbling ritual. At some point, she noticed me. She stood at the window for a long time, lips moving as if muttering an apology to herself that she didn't dare say aloud to anyone else. She called me after midnight. Her name flashed across my phone and I almost didn't answer. The message that played back later was thin and high. "This is Karen. I expect you to stop this nonsense. I will not have my name dragged through the mud." There was a clink in the background, maybe a glass, maybe a display of bravado. I didn't call her back. Instead, I drove across the street and knocked on the retired vet's door. We sat in lawn chairs under a sky too bright with stars, and mapped out a plan that was part legal strategy and part psychological warfare. The audit would prove the financials. The board would remove her. The county could press charges if necessary. But beyond the paperwork, there was something else we could do. Something that would not rely solely on auditors and lawyers. We could make it impossible for her to operate in the neighborhood at the level she had been operating. We drafted a petition for a special meeting to be held after the audit, an official, by-the-books call, where the entire community could vote on restitution terms and governance changes. We would propose amendments, remove unilateral fine authority, require 3 signatures for expenditures above a small threshold, term limits for the president. We would require transparency so that no one could quietly siphon funds ever again. And in the back of my head, like a glinting thought I couldn't shake, I began to imagine the moment when Karen read, in black and white, the audit's conclusions. I pictured the look on her face when the county auditor mentioned the words embezzlement and restitution. I imagined her being required by law, by the board, by a community she had betrayed, to pay back funds, to make amends, to answer for the years of petty cruelty. That image warmed something in me. Not maliciousness, not exactly, but the satisfying heat of justice finally arriving. We were not home free. Karen could sue, delay, and intimidate. She could lie. She could beg and we could falter. But for the first time since the orange slip had been taped to my door, I didn't feel small. The neighborhood had rallied. The bylaws were in our favor if we used them correctly. We had a CPA who smelled fraud. We had witnesses. We had momentum. And most importantly, we had the meeting. The audit would come back in days, not weeks. When it did, either Karen would find a way to slither out, or she would be exposed. Either way, the next move would have to be decisive. As I lay awake that night, the hum of the refrigerator like a tired metronome, I thought of the coffee table I had built in my garage, the one she had fined me for selling. It was a small thing, sanded wood, hand-cut joints, a slab of walnut with a story in its rings. I'd built it for a friend, then for the pleasure of making something that would last. Karen's fines had tried to turn craftsmanship into a crime. The irony was that building it had shown me how to make things hold together under pressure, so when the audit report arrived days later and the CPA called me with a voice that had the careful gravity of someone who'd seen too much, I didn't rush to celebration. I sat on my porch and breathed, preparing for the part where we would need to be cold and methodical, not vengeful. Karma, if it existed, would prefer paperwork to theatrics. He told me what I had suspected: irregular disbursements, missing approvals, personal benefits paid by HOA funds. He suggested the language his office would use in an official report. He recommended we file with the county prosecutor. He warned that moving too fast without counsel would leave us open to countersuits. I thanked him and told him to proceed. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again, an anonymous text. "You think you can take her down? She knows things about people here." The threat was blunt and hollow. It was the last gasp of someone who had been king for too long. I looked up at the sky, then across the street at the houses, windows like watchful eyes, and felt for the first time in a long while the steady certainty of being on the right side of something. The board, the CPA, and the county were moving. Karen was rattled. The neighborhood had hope. The trap was set. Everything from here on out would be about making sure the consequences matched the crimes. The orange slip on my door looked like a parking ticket but felt like a declaration of war. I read the neat, officious typeface twice before my brain finished translating it into the language it actually spoke. $500. Improper vehicle storage. They wanted my truck gone from my driveway overnight. The absurdity should have been laughable. Instead, it felt like someone had reached into my life, rearranged the furniture, and handed me a bill for the audacity of living. I stood on the porch with that slip in my hand and, from across the cul-de-sac, watched the curtain twitch, a little reveal of a face I already knew. Karen. She stood in her living room like a captain on a bridge, watching the neighborhood with the keen focus of someone picking at seams. She wanted me to respond. She wanted me to rage and beg. She wanted drama. I smiled, folded the paper, and put it in my pocket. The truck wasn't a rust bucket. It was an F-150 I kept clean because I liked to take care of my things. It was in my driveway because I'd turned my garage into a workshop, a place of sawdust and vice grips where I made coffee tables, fixed chairs, and earned a few bucks on the side. I told Karen this when I introduced myself the first week I moved in. She had smiled then, but not with anything like warmth. That smile was the kind of smile you wear when you're already composing someone's obituary in your head. Paying the fine felt like buying time. I handed over the money because I didn't want a lien slapping my name on county records while I figured out a plan. But every fine I paid was a stone laid into a fire I was building, and every period she slapped on the end of a supposed violation was fuel. Over the next few weeks, she found reasons that read like satire. A bird feeder I hung on an oak. Unauthorized exterior modification, $200. A porch light I forgot to take down after the fourth 150. A truck parked too close to the curb, $500 again. Each violation came with a neat little form, a clause cited, and a thinly veiled smile from her at her window, as though she were keeping a scrapbook of the punishments she doled out. Most neighbors took her at face value. They nodded at her comfort, at her insistence that she was only protecting property values. A few told me quietly that she had fined them for nonsense and then waved the fines away once they voiced resistance, only if they were women or elderly or thin with fear. But enough people were quietly aflame. The retired vet who had his chair fined for being unsightly furniture, the couple whose treehouse was threatened because it wasn't optimized for neighborhood aesthetics, the young family whose kids' bicycle once became a safety hazard. Karen didn't just hand out fines, she weaponized them. I requested the HOA bylaws and the financials like any paranoid tenant might. Polite, procedural, bylaw 4.2 requests in hand. Karen stalled. She used bureaucratic tricks, a missing signature here, a misplaced ledger there, until I reminded her that the law doesn't listen to intimidation. When the documents finally arrived, I read them with a calm that surprised me. There were invoices for beautification work with vendor addresses that matched landscaping on Karen's property. There were administrative fees that appeared nowhere in the bylaws. There were fines issued without recorded votes. It wasn't merely abuse of power. It pointed over and over to something else. A steady siphoning of HOA funds into her personal projects. You don't win a war by announcing it. You win it by making a map of the battlefield. I began with whispers. I talked to neighbors who had been too ashamed to speak. I sat with the older couple who'd been fined for an imaginary fence and took their binders. I spoke with the vet about his bills. The young dad produced a shoebox of fines and unsigned notices. Every story I heard was a mirror of my own, a petty rule weaponized into extortion. They were afraid of liens, foreclosures, legal fees, the way a small, decisive person can turn the machinery of governance into a grinding machine for your life. But when enough people tell the same story, fear begins to thin. When we looked at the ledgers together, we stopped seeing isolated injustices. We saw a pattern, and pattern is the first ingredient in proof. She grew bolder as I grew methodical. The fines kept coming, absurd and cruel. Running an unlicensed business from a residential area for selling a coffee table I'd made to a friend out of my garage. Excessive outdoor storage for a toolbox. The aggression escalated the more she thought she owned the narrative. Her overreach became sloppy, and sloppy is a blessing when you're trying to find the threads of a suit that's been tailor-made to hide stains. The annual HOA meeting approached like a clock winding itself toward a hand I could stop. Karen practiced her lines about community standards, property values, and her devotion to keeping things nice. She took the meeting room like a stage, and rehearsed her speeches as if they were prayers. I rehearsed my own remarks in the kitchen mirror, carving out silence to calibrate nerves into precision. At the meeting, she arrived in armor, pearls, pristine blouse, a little placard that read HOA President. She moved through the folding chairs and smiled like someone greeting her army. When she began her sermon, the room hummed politely. Then I stood. I spoke in a voice that tried to be more ledger than vendetta. Facts, clauses, specific citations. I handed out copies of invoices and bank statements to the secretary, receipts that tied contractors to Karen's property, checks that left the HOA account and reappeared in her driveway improvements. The room shifted. People who'd been small at their own kitchen tables stood taller. The old woman whose grandson had lost his treehouse wept as she spoke of a $400 fine that had come with a lien threat. The retired vet showed a check that should have gone to common area landscaping and had instead paid for a new deck at Karen's house. She began to swivel and sputter. There were accusations of forgery, of conspiracy. She threatened legal action as if yelling were a shield. But the bylaws, those small boring rules most people never read, were on our side. We pushed for an immediate moratorium on new fines and a temporary suspension of Karen's authority to sign checks. Procedural moves that would buy us time and prevent further misappropriation if the audit confirmed what the ledgers suggested. The floor voted. It felt like all the little injustices were being cataloged and counted, and then overturned by the sheer weight of community. The votes passed. Her power, so long exerted like gravity, thinned like fog. After the meeting, she called a lawyer. The emails came with the sort of legalistic teeth designed to scare small communities into submission. They accused me of libel and defamation, and hinted at lawsuits that would be expensive and ugly. We handed those letters to the CPA we'd been able to recruit, a sharp man who looked more annoyed than impressed when he read through our files. He called the discrepancies notable and recommended a formal audit. It was good language. It was the language of men who wanted to be precise before they struck. He told us how to build the paper trail the county would need: signed statements, copies of checks, vendor confirmations. We compiled everything like jurors building a narrative. Karen retaliated in private, threatening texts, muffled phone calls. An anonymous note slipped under my door that said, "She knows things about you." There's a certain ugliness in being threatened by someone who's been stealing from your neighbors, like a petty thief trying to frighten you into ignoring the theft. It was meant to intimidate, and it barely shook us. We were past fear. We were into something colder and more effective: the slow work of law. I imagined the county auditor in his suit flipping pages, the way a surgeon would flip tissue to find a foreign object. The audit came back in the form of a phone call that felt both clinical and vindicating. Unapproved disbursements, unclear authorizations, receipts that didn't match any common area project. The CPA's voice had that measured tone people use when giving bad news they're almost glad to deliver. He recommended filing with the county prosecutor. He warned that litigation could drag on and that Karen would fight. He urged patience. Patience smelled like cotton and antiseptic, but patience was also the most devastating weapon available to anyone who wanted real results. Revenge is a lot less satisfying if it's legalistic, but justice, especially the kind that returns stolen money and strips titles, has its own satisfying angle. We scheduled a special meeting after the audit. We drafted amendments to the bylaws, multiple signatures required for check approvals, term limits for the president, transparent monthly financial postings. The petition read like an exorcism. We were removing the tools of secrecy. We collected signatures, and with every name we gathered, the neighborhood's spine grew straighter. She lashed out with lawyers and then, predictably, with pleas. In polite neighbors' living rooms, she presented tearful stories about pressure, about being overwhelmed, about mistakes made in passion for keeping the neighborhood clean. It was theater. It was also a legal strategy, soften sentiment to blunt liability. But the audit pages were not sympathetic. Numbers have a way of being cruelly honest. The vote was decisive. The bylaws changed. Her signing authority was stripped. The board removed her as president pending a criminal inquiry. The county sent a notice that an investigation was being opened into possible misuse of HOA funds. It felt like the room shifting under her feet. The slow realization that the scaffolding she'd built to hold up her vanity was being dismantled. If that had been the end, I might have gone back to sanding wood and saving for better tools. But the question of restitution remained. Karen had fined and bullied people for years. She had also siphoned money that belonged to all of us. The county's involvement turned up evidence that more than petty violations were at play. Invoices for private property improvements processed as community projects, payments to vendors that matched landscaping work only at her house, reimbursements for community events that had never happened. The prosecutor asked for witness statements and copies of anything that might show direct coordination. We had plenty. Then came the final, deliciously mundane part of the process: accounting. A checkbook doesn't lie. A vendor's invoice signed off by a treasurer doesn't forget whose yard it was used for. We laid everything out at a meeting, and the unhappy arithmetic resolved into a single conclusion: restitution. There would be a trial of sorts inside the HOA, paperwork and votes and legal forms, and there would be hopefully a criminal reckoning. The most satisfying thing wasn't the prospect of prison, it was watching her be required to hand back what she took. On the morning the prosecutor called to confirm charges could be filed, I didn't leap for joy. This was not an I won moment. This was the adult satisfaction of systems working as they should. Karen had been given all the time she needed to explain herself, to produce receipts that matched claims. She could not. The county's letter asked for her to produce documentation supporting the expenditures, and when she failed to do so, the options narrowed. We had acted correctly. Process had been followed. In the end, the law does not respect charisma. It respects paper. News of the probe spread fast. Some neighbors felt guilty for their silence. Others felt vindicated. There were apologies in grocery aisles and awkward waves across fences. Karen's house, once a little palace of curated landscaping, began to look like any other house with a woman who had kept secrets. She sold her car. She petitioned for leniency in board meetings and outside them, trying to trade confession for a lighter penalty. The board insisted on restitution and on transparency measures. The county insisted on paying attention. There was a final meeting where we discussed the exact terms of repayment and the governance restructuring that would prevent a repeat. I listened as neighbors, people who hadn't spoken up for years, outlined changes that would make everything harder for a would-be Karen to steal from the community again. We added protections against unilateral actions and created an independent review board with rotating membership. We established a zero-tolerance policy for using HOA funds on private property. The meeting felt like a small, careful mending of something torn. The quiet after the storm was a different kind of loud. People talked about what it felt like to reclaim their neighborhood. They traded stories about petty fines and bigger harms, and in the telling, the community repaired itself. I went back to my garage and picked up a chisel and a plane and sanded the edges of a new table. Making something that held together under pressure became, in itself, a kind of therapy. Karen moved away a few months later. She left with a pile of papers and a lawyer's advice and fewer friends than she'd expected. The HOA received restitution and set up a small fund to help neighbors who had been unfairly fined cover legal costs. People joked that I should raise her fees by $5,000 and call it square. The truth was simpler. The neighborhood had gotten its voice back, and that mattered more than a petty revenge tally. But sometimes, late at night, when the porch light casts a rectangle that looks like a stage, I pass by her old house and imagine the ledger in her hands, numbers that in the end were the cause of her undoing. She'd thought herself untouchable because rules were words and people are forgetful. She'd forgotten that community, once awake, remembers everything. In the end, justice was mostly ordinary: paper and signatures and people finally reading the fine print. It was less cinematic than I'd imagined and far more satisfying because it was real. We rebuilt our bylaws, our trust, and our gardens. I built another coffee table and gave it away. The truck stayed in my driveway when it needed to. And when a new HOA president was elected, she walked through the neighborhood without a clipboard and with a smile that wasn't a weapon. Sometimes neighbors stop me and say, "We owe you one." I shake my head. We owed each other all along. And the orange slip? I still have it tucked in a drawer. It's a reminder that small papers can ignite big changes, especially when a few neighbors decide they're not going to be afraid anymore.